So a lot of students misunderstand planned aggregate expenditure and aggregate expenditure, and they don't fully understand the difference between the two of them. So today I'm going to explain what's the difference between planned aggregate expenditure and regular aggregate expenditure, and the components that make up each of them. So planned aggregate expenditure is just the spending and output that firms, consumers, and others are intending to make, that they're planning to make, as it's in the name. It's just represented by the formula PAE equals A plus B times Y. And A stands for autonomous expenditure. Autonomous expenditures are just payments that people make regardless of their income, regardless of why. So these are typically things that they have to spend, basic necessities for the most part. While marginal propensity to consume, that's the constant fraction of a person's disposable income that they use to consume goods and services. When a person gets a raise, for example, their marginal propensity to consume increases because they can actually use more of their disposable income to consume products. And regular aggregate expenditure, right, so that's just simply like the total spending and production that has already occurred. There's nothing planned about that. It's what's actually happened now. And so firms react to what they initially planned for their aggregate expenditure to be, compared to how it actually is now. And that's typically the basis of how they plan to produce output for the next production cycle. And knowing this gives us a model of the entire economy. For example, government spending occurs independent of GDP, actually, because the government spends based on what its citizens need, or at least on the belief, the perception of what its citizens need. And net exports are also independent of GDP as well, same with investment. So with these principles in mind, it gives us a more full equation, I would say, to planned aggregate expenditure that I have typed out in the Canva. And yes, so I would say the one last thing I would add to the end of this is that I mentioned earlier briefly that firms react to how low or how high their aggregate expenditure is compared to the planned aggregate expenditure. And so typically when the planned aggregate expenditure is lower than the actual aggregate expenditure, then that incentivizes firms to actually increase output for the next production cycle. And vice versa, when planned aggregate expenditure is higher than the actual aggregate expenditure, that incentivizes these firms to produce less output for the next production cycle. And that's really all that I can add to what's already been written down if you are having trouble understanding aggregate versus planned aggregate expenditure. And have a good rest of y'all's day.